Hi, everybody. Welcome to Trusty's Vintage Deep Dive. We've got a couple minutes to the hour, but we're going to go ahead and do the introductions, see how many people are joining us this evening. And looks like we've already got a good turnout coming into the chat. Hopefully you're all ready to hear a great presentation, a great discussion, a great deep dive with George from the Antique Nomad on vintage cameras. He's just been giving me a little bit of a primer because I feel completely unworthy of standing against him on this area. But as always, he just threw a couple tidbits my way, and it's been even fun just getting prepped for the actual interview. So we'll go ahead and start probably in a couple minutes once we get a few more people joining in and people can find the individual channel. But welcome to Mark, Constellation Pegasus, joining us. Great. Hope you enjoy the session. And Hemlock Lady, welcome back. And Teresa, thank you very much for joining us. And the way this will work, it is not a sale. So just, we're going to be clear of that up front, that this is a deep dive for information. But because we've got George live, you will be able to ask questions. So just like you do with the purchasing items in the live chat, use that live chat to ask questions to George. So we'll be monitoring that. Xenomorph is also backstage. He'll be helping along. And so you've got all your favorites, just like you typically see on George's channel, my channel. And really appreciate you giving us some of your Sunday night. Maybe you make this into a family event, but for the most part, hoping you're going to enjoy it. So we got New Zealand represented. New Zealand's in the house with Nate. So that's great. Nate's got his collector's cases were delivered, and he's been overdoing it trying to get those filled up. So hopefully he'll be posting some videos of what he's got. I saw a couple snapshots, and he has collections I didn't even know he had. So he is definitely somebody you want to watch. If you don't subscribe to his channel, you definitely want to take a look at 1969 Nathaniel. There's some fun collections, and also very informative, talking about some pretty specialty collections. We're at the top of the hour, so we will go ahead and get things started. So again, welcome everybody to Trusty's Vintage Deep Dive. If you've not been here before, I am Patrick with Trusty Huckster Mercantile. Trusty Huckster Mercantile is actually a vintage reseller. I have a presence on Etsy. You can find me there at THMercantile. I also have social media presence on Facebook and Instagram under the same THMercantile. I started these deep dives. I've only done 2 of them so far, but they've been pretty well received. So I actually have the rest of the summer already booked up. I'll be doing them 2 times a month. And one of the first people I had reached out to, and I wanted to do these deep dives to really get the history and really get some knowledgeable information about a specific topic or a specific item. George was one of the first people that I reached out to. And so I am thrilled that we were able to work out our schedules. I'm thrilled that he went through the vast variety of knowledge and collections that he has available to come up with what I think is going to be a really fun topic. So to get things started, I want to go ahead and let George introduce himself.
Well, thank you, everybody. It's really good to see you all, and I see a lot of friends and familiar faces in the chat, so thanks for coming and taking a look. I am George, the Antique Nomad, and I am an antique dealer who does shows, estate sales, appraisals. I've been in the business for a while, and I also have a YouTube channel, the Antique Nomad, as most of you know. I am on social media, on Periscope and Twitter and Instagram and all that stuff. And I actually, a couple of weeks ago, put a camera out there and got a really nice response to it. So Patrick contacted me about doing this and said, well, show us some of your collections. And I said, well, the collection I have right now that I think is the most interesting isn't really my collection, but I've just come into this huge collection of cameras. And he said, well, are you a collector? And I said, well, no. And then I started looking around and I saw, well, the little brownie box camera on the shelf that had next to the grandparents' picture. And I saw my old Pentax from college. And then I realized I was staring at a GoPro and 2 Nikons and a webcam and a phone cam. And I realized, yes, indeed, I am a camera collector. And all of us who are enjoying this YouTube world have the camera to thank for it. So it's really made me delve in deeper myself. And I'm excited to share with you some of the stuff that has come my way and tell you all about it.
And that's great. We're so excited to have you here. Anyone who has followed George at the Antique Nomad, whether you follow his YouTube channels, his Instagram, anything that he does, he is so knowledgeable about so many different things. That's kind of what he's gotten a name for. And so I'm just so thrilled to have him share it tonight. But one of the things that we really had to work through to get things started was these are intended to be deep dives. I do want these to be informative, not just a show and tell. And the idea of cameras is such a broad category. We had to try and figure out how we were going to kind of pinpoint it to make it to fit within a 1 hour segment, which is what we're trying to do. So one of the things that we did was, I know a lot of what we're covering is going to be 20th century photography, but I think when George and I were prepping for this, I think he's got a couple things he wanted to mention, even getting into 19th, and then let's get going from there. So why don't you get us started with your little crash course on 19th century and 20th century photography.
Absolutely. Well, that sounds great. Now, I think that it's important to note that the camera was one of the most complicated pieces of technology that there was. And I'm the kind of person who, I love talking about the history of things, but I hate dry presentations where someone reads off dates and things and just talks about that. So what I really want to do is illustrate by showing you some of this stuff. But let's start briefly, because I can't go back all the way in time, because the camera really started developing in the Islamic world in about 1100. There was a philosopher by the name, I've got to read this one because I always massacre names, Ibn al-Haytham. And he was a philosopher, and he developed the camera obscura. I don't know if any of you, when you were kids, remember the little pinhole camera where you take a box and you poke a hole in it, and then you can look inside and you see whatever it was in reverse. Well, that's the guy who figured that out. And it was a really big deal because it was the first time you could actually capture an image. Now, they couldn't capture it in any permanent way, but he developed a whole room where he made the whole room into a pinhole camera, essentially, and could see what was outside this otherwise black box he was standing in. So that black box room became the cameras that we use now. And they were called camera obscura, which is Latin for obscura is dark, and camera means basically chamber, so a dark room in a sense. I remember as a kid, we had to watch an eclipse through a pinhole camera because you couldn't stare at it directly. It was too bright. By the 1500s, Leonardo da Vinci and other great artists were using them to do tracing. And so at that point, in the middle of the Renaissance, was the beginning of people trying to figure out, this is great, but how do we capture an image and preserve it forever? And they didn't really come up with a way to do that until the 1830s. They knew that silver salt, if it was exposed to light, would make an image, and that they could do something with that. But a guy named Daguerre in France came up with a way using glass plates, mercury vapor, and a bunch of other really nasty chemicals to get an image to actually stay on a glass plate and stay there where you could actually see it. And I wish I had a daguerreotype to show you. I'm sold out right now. But when you look at them, they usually look kind of like they're in the cases, like the Union cases, like tintypes were, but it's going to look almost like you're seeing through the image and there's another plate behind. And so it's, they were great. He got a huge pension from the country of France and was considered quite a hero for his work, but it was glass plates. They were easy to break. They were hard to, they didn't have a negative, so you couldn't make more of them. You basically got one and that was it. And so a guy in England figured out a couple of years later that a way to do calotypes, which is a way to put it on paper. And that was the beginning of photography like we think of it now.
Good question, George. And this is something we hadn't talked about or prepped for. But as you started talking about the Union cases, it made me think about just some of the little bit that I've been exposed to. Which were the ones that were sealed in the Union cases that basically you couldn't have, it was designed so you wouldn't have air or anything enter into it? Was that
those were daguerreotypes generally that were sealed. And the reason they were sealed is you didn't want air or water to get behind the image because it would start to take it away. And so later on, when you get into tintypes, Then those were more exposed. You can touch it and feel them, but that was the idea. So the earlier ones were generally daguerreotypes. The guy who made Wedgwood pottery, his son figured out actually, he was one of the people who figured out to use camera obscura and make pictures, but they would all turn black. Well, then finally they figured out how to use a fixative so that they would stay put. And that's the beginning of the pictures on paper that we're more familiar with. And then let's see, I wanted to show you this. I've got stuff spread out all over me, so if I look down a lot, it's because I'm trying to make sure I get the right thing. This is a later version, but this is what early cameras looked like. They might be big, they might be little, but basically they had this bellows. That's because this was basically how you focused, and they were made of wood. And as you were, you could also attach lenses eventually to them. The lenses were these giant brass things. They're quite beautiful. And they actually, by the late 1800s, had figured out how to do the different stops so that you had different speed to get more or less light in. One thing you may have noticed is that, do you ever see old photos of Victorian people, Patrick?
Yes, I have, and they're usually larger formats, and they tend to be very. They seem to be very mad, very angry.
Yes, yes, exactly. They're all very dour, and there's a reason for that. For a long time, photographs had to be taken on a tripod, so they'd have generally a plate camera, and it'd be much bigger than this. It'd be, you know, maybe 5 or 6 times the size of this thing, but it'd be a big plate. They had to have a shroud over it. They'd put their head in and take the picture because no light could come in other than through the lens, or it would destroy the image. A lot of the early studio photographers were actually women because it was considered an artistic pursuit, so it was acceptable for a woman to go into that business. And so that's pretty cool because, you know, generally women in business in the Victorian era, you don't think of that, but a lot of photographers were. And the reason that the people look so sour is the exposure times were really long for a while. It could take like as long as between 3 and up to 30 minutes. And so they said, sit there and don't smile, because if you smile, you can't hold that forever and it's going to look all blurry. So everyone looks like this. And it's really quite disturbing. We
now,
had
at
one
what point did the plates, like you said that was a smaller plate, so some of them are larger. Is that the plate would basically be what turned into the negative that we know today? So could you make prints off of that plate, or was that more like a one-time use plate?
Actually, you could make more than one of the same picture this way. And because the plates, that's when you start getting into carte de vistas, which are those cabinet cards on cardboard, where it's generally a portrait of someone. And the great thing was in the, well, the bad thing and the great thing. The bad thing was that in the Crimean War and the Civil War, other than people sitting for portraits, the only pictures that could be done were the aftermath, because it took so long for the plates to develop and everything. So they couldn't do it during battle. They couldn't do action photography. And so it actually showed the real horrors of war. And there was a big reaction against the Crimean War in a lot of the countries that were involved in it, because for the first time they could see that it wasn't just glory and heroes, that it was really a vicious and terrible thing. But there was a company called Voigtlander from Germany. Now, this is a 20th century one, but this is one of their cameras. And they were the first ones to come up with the an all-metal camera with a lens fast enough to solve that problem. And that was the beginning of candid photography, because people could actually take a camera and the lens would go fast enough that they could actually shoot something and capture it. So they could actually shoot a bird flying in a tree or a moose running in the woods, and they could actually get that down. So in the 1870s and 80s, all of a sudden photography starts to become something that is more for the masses. You still had to have money to have a camera, but anybody could probably use one. Well, not anybody. They were a little complicated. And that is when a guy named George Eastman comes along.
Before we move into Mr. Eastman, we've got a question that came in that I'm wondering if it falls into this transition between the plates and the regular photography. And it's from Michelle at Mermaid Cove. Now, she mentions a reference in 1921, but she's talking about effectively what ends up being, I think, a double exposure photograph. And is that something, I guess it did exist beyond the plates, but what type of, is that a special type of camera, a special type of medium? How, in general, what type of camera would be used to make a double photo like that?
Okay, I'm reading the question, and my guess is that based on what I learned when I took photography back in the old days when you had to actually use a darkroom and negatives, my guess is that they actually use two negatives and burn them together to create one image with the two photos together. Now, there is a thing called a stereo camera, which I'll show, but that doesn't really come along for most people until the 50s. So when we get to that era, I'll show that, and that's a different kind of double image, and we'll talk about that a little bit too, because they're really cool. I actually have decided I'm going to buy one of the stereo cameras from my client and try to get some film and shoot it for reasons that I'll talk about when we get to that point.
Well, then you jump fast forward into the 1990s. You've got those wonderful glamour shots that you could have the photo and then another photo up in the corner, and you're looking up lovingly at somebody else. So I guess double exposure is still around, but that's just interesting in the timing. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your flow there, but I thought that might be an interesting.
No, that's great. I love questions or why we're here. I'm learning a lot by taking on this collection and getting ready for this, and I want everyone else to ask questions because we're here to all learn together. So anyhow, so George Eastman comes along, and he is in Rochester, New York. And the reason that he's there is because he's into cameras and he wants to develop a camera. And Rochester is the home of Bausch and Lomb, and they are a lens maker at that time for telescopes and binoculars and scientific instruments. And you need good lenses in cameras. So he decides to make a camera. And I'm not sure, I can't remember the story about where he came up with the name, but he decided to call it the Kodak. And it was one of the first.
I know something George doesn't know.
Oh, good. Tell me.
I must revel in this moment. No, it's a totally made up name. And the idea behind the name was he definitely knew, because he was competing with the German manufacturers, he was trying to find an American alphabet using letters that would be universal across the globe. So the K can only be ever used as a K sound. I mean, you put it with an N afterwards, you can throw it. But he wanted a strong sounding letter, and he didn't want something like a C or something that could be changed depending on how it's pronounced in Italian and German. So that was where the K came from. And then he wanted it something that would be bold, as we put the K at the beginning and the end, and then put simple letters in the middle. So it was a short name that could actually be branded very easily on a small product and be universally pronounced without being changed as you jumped into other languages.
Oh, that's really cool. I love that story. And, it makes perfect sense. That was actually the beginning of people coming up with company names and names for products that weren't a thing. And that's a very good reason why. And it ended up being one of the 10 most recognized brand names around the world at its peak. So that he did a good thing. About 1888, he came up with the whole, sort of basically point and shoot camera. He came up with he was the first to use celluloid film. And that was a big deal because you could use, you didn't have to use this wet plate process anymore to get your pictures. And so it made it a lot less messy. Basically, they could use heat to set images quickly. And so it was easier to do. But his early cameras, you really can't find them because they'd send you the camera with the film in it, and then you had to send the whole thing back to Kodak to be developed in New York, and then they'd send you the pictures back at first. So the first 10 or 12 years of Kodak cameras really don't exist because they cracked them open and threw the case away. But around 1900, he came up with the Brownie. Now, this is another company. This is Ansco, who took the same concept, because once he came up with the Brownie, every company made something like this. But this basically is from right around 1900, 1910. Very, very simple camera. You see these a lot at estate sales. They're not expensive because they made millions of them. It's just basically a box you put rolled film in, and you shut it, you turn the wheel. There's this little thing in the top you look through, and that's where you get your view. And then you go click, and that lets the shutter go. Shutters were a really big deal because you could control the flow of light in a way that hadn't been before. Your focus was basically look in here, and if it looks sort of in focus, they're really fuzzy. I don't know how anyone could tell. Well, then you just sort of hoped, and then you turn the wheel, and that's it. So we see these a lot. These are something that you will see at thrift stores. You'll see them in estate sales. They usually, you know, wholesale around $10 and sell in retail for, you know, around 20 for a typical black one, which is what we see mainly. And they're pretty cool. And all of a sudden that meant that everybody had access to photography. They were inexpensive and really simple to use. And for the first time, all sorts of people could do snapshots and candid photography.
Before we move on to the next level, can you pull up the Brownie again? As you were showing it, on the side, it looked like there was another, right next in front of the dial, it looked like there's another, a window. What is what's in front of the dial?
Yeah, this particular one has two different viewers. So you could look down. Originally, you'd hold this down by your waist and you would look down and be able to focus. But with this one was pretty fancy because you could also look from the side. So if you were holding the camera up or doing it some other way, you had a different way to view it. So this one was kind of super deluxe because it's got two different places to view.
Well, I've never seen one like that. That's great.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. And, you know, the thing is that you get, this is a tin type. They really are on tin, and don't they look like fun? And then out of the Brownie, you get these little snapshots. And a lot of them are really tiny like this at first. This guy with the hat's probably from about 1910. Mortimer Pumphrey is his name. So it's kind of cool. You start to really be able to, you know, everybody starts to be able to preserve family history. They can pass the ancestors down for the first time. It's a pretty revolutionary thing at the time. But there was a problem, and that was that if any of you folks out there have astigmatism, you know what that means. It means your focus is pretty good up close, and if you want to do anything farther out, you really can't see without glasses. And what are glasses? They're lenses. So a guy named Carl Zeiss in Germany, this is going to be a little later piece. Let me see if I can find the Zeiss camera.
If you're looking for that, we actually had a question pop up because I had highlighted that extra window, 1969 Nathaniel. Nate is asking if that extra window does affect the value in any way.
A little bit. They're a little more deluxe. We're going to see another Brownie in a little bit that's got rather high value, but that has more to do with the design. The extra window is something that was uncommon at first and became commonplace pretty quickly. So maybe a little more value because they look cool. Most of the people who buy those are not shooting film in them. Although I should mention, you can get vintage film, I mean, like new film made for any vintage camera that ever existed. There are outfits. There's a place in Seattle called Glazers. I know there's a place in New York. There's various film people around the world who still like to shoot these old cameras. And so you actually can get film for them. Yeah, that Zeiss is, oh, here we go. Okay, so this is a later one, but I'll show you the logo on the top. This is a Zeiss icon, and we'll talk about why it has two lenses when we get to a little later phase here. But Zeiss was the guy who came up with what they called an anti-stigmat camera lens. And that meant that all of a sudden you had a focal length that was a lot longer. And this is the beginning of art photography. Some of these cameras we're going to show are the things that made iconic images. I mean, Margaret Bourke White for Life magazine, and all the way up to, you know, pictures of celebrities and presidents. All this stuff were made with this material. And that was because the Germans came up with the anti-stigma lens, the anti-astigmatism. They also were able to start making 35 millimeter cameras as well, because the lenses could shoot on 35 millimeter film. So that became the format of choice, and a company called Lights came out with that in 1935. And very quickly, Kodak realized that the Germans were making really good lenses, so why beat them when you can join them? So here is a Kodak. This is called a Retinette. This one's probably from about 1940, but this particular one is an anti-astigma lens, and it is a 35 millimeter camera. And it is really surprising what some of these early 35 millimeters are selling for. Have you looked up any auction records or anything like that? Do you follow that at all?
Nothing that I have, but that was one of the questions I was going to ask, because if you're saying the Germans invented this basically between the two wars, and then Kodak basically said, okay, I need to do this too. Is there one that's more collectible than the other? Because technically then the Germans would be older, but I would are they as collectible, maybe in the American market, are they as collectible as the American versions of it?
They absolutely are. You are correct about that, because they made such good cameras. And later, even the Japanese cameras, there's a lot of collectors. There was a Leica lights camera made the Leica. And there is one that was made for Hermes. I'm sorry, I always say that. I killed foreign language, but the very high-end French company that makes the very expensive things like $500 scarves, and their stores are all in places like, you know, Palm Beach and Pebble Beach and places like that. One of theirs that was made in the 1920s sold recently for $19,000. So and you know, some guy found it in an estate sale. There are sleepers out there, and so it really you do want to look for early German cameras. Absolutely, great thing to look out for.
And that's one of the questions Katie's asking. So what's the most expensive camera to collect? Is it a brand or a style? Which tends to kind of win out?
It tends to be, it depends on the situation. It tends to be more about an obscure combination of features, because all through photography you had professional level and you had amateur level, and the professional level was expensive when new, expensive now, and also in much less supply, because there were only so many professionals taking pictures, but there were lots of people who were amateurs taking pictures. So you'll see lower end amateur cameras a lot. But if you see something, it's really funny how two cameras that look very similar have a different feature, a faster lens, a bigger lens, some new technology that was made for a brief period of time. So it's really much more specific. I'm realizing I have a lot of specific research to do on this collection, because it really depends on a particular piece. You can have, for example, the Kodak Retina I showed, this particular one. Well, there's a Retina 2 and a Retina 3 that sell for about $200 or $300, but this one I think is more in like the 30 or 45 range, if I'm not mistaken, and they look very similar. If you find interesting old cameras, it sure pays to do just a little bit of research and look at things like the numbering on the lens. I'll pick that one up again. You know, this one says it's upside down to you, but this is a Schneider Kreutzig, there we go, Reomar, and it's a 1:35 ratio and a 4.5 millimeter, and that all has to do with aperture size and lens speed and all of that. You want to really get into that kind of detail if you're doing your research, so that you can find out what the values are.
In general, would it be, as a kind of a rule of thumb, obviously research is always going to will out, but as a rule of thumb, do collectors want to see the first generation of the new technology, or like a second or third once it's already been worked out and is actually functional?
I think in the real world, people want it actually functional, but I think collectors want the early obscure things. They don't care. They want the camera to work, and there's a lot of things you should look at with the camera. I'll show you one that's a neat example. We see these in black a lot, but this one is in red, and this particular one is it's a Kodak, and it's I believe it's called a Hodex, if I remember right. This was something that would have been made in black, but then the Depression came, and this is why when you also are talking about value, it's also obscure things. A lot of cameras that were made during the Depression were rather obscure. This one was a pretty famous one called the Hawkeye Folding Model B. In black, it's a pretty common camera, but you notice this says Rainbow Hawkeye. Well, this one is red. They decided in the Depression that they needed to sell color because they needed to have a reason for people to buy a camera during the Depression when people were broke. So these colored cameras, a black version of this sells for maybe $30, $35. And this one in red is worth somewhere around $100 from what I understand, $100 to $125. And it's just because of that. Because in the 30s, what happens is they're trying to get reasons for people to buy, so consumerism starts to take over. And it becomes more, you asked about styles. It becomes more about style. And Kodak hired a guy named Walter Dorwin Teague, who was a famous Art Deco designer. He and Russell Wright and a group went to the Art Deco exposition in Paris in 1925 to discover why the Parisians thought that we were behind in our design and why we weren't invited, basically. And they found out why, because everything we were doing was derivative of European design. So they came back and started with streamlined design. For the simple Brownie camera, another thing, by the way, if you find them with the original box, yes, that adds value. Absolutely, because people didn't keep the boxes back then. Notice how this has an Art Deco front. This is one of his designs. And the reason they did the Art Deco front is because the streamlining gave it a feel, a look that was modern and unique. So this Brownie Junior, which again is your same basic camera, this one's got the places to view on both sides. Your same basic camera, but with this front, I believe is worth about $100 as opposed to maybe 15 or 20 for the plain version. And then another one that he made about that time, there was a whole series called Kodak Bantam, and there are several different versions of this. But this one has its box. And look at the cool pinstriping. It looks like it should go with some gangster's zoot suit from that era. And I just think this is the neatest looking thing because I'm a big Art Deco fan. I collected Art Deco style stuff for years. And this camera should be worth in the $200 to $300 range. And it all has to do with the design. So
and did that front close? Is that
it does, yeah. Yeah, these are a little tricky, and I sometimes have to fiddle around. Let me see if I can show you.
You don't have to close it. I saw that ledge, and I was wondering.
They do. They fold up, and like this one, there's different ways. You kind of have to take some time and figure each one out. This one, you press here, you press this button, the bellows go back in, you flip it up, and you turn this way to lock it, I think, or the other way. And there's this neat little package. So they do fold up and they turn into a nice little camera. But again, you're looking at these rather simple cameras, especially the Brownie, and there's a ton of old snapshots with people with their heads cut off, people with the thumb in front of the camera, people where it's not really in focus. And camera makers started to figure out that, yeah, it's great to make cute, fancy styles, but what we really need to do is solve some of the problems with the technology. And that's going to get people to want to buy them. And so there was a company in Japan called Canon. This one's a little later. I think this is a 50s version, but we've probably all heard of Canon. Canon in 1936 was the company that discovered the way to make the rangefinder. And what that was, the big problem was that you couldn't really tell how to focus depending on how far something was away. Well, with the rangefinder, and I'm going to show you an American-made one, this one has been stripped of its black casing, but it's kind of cool. And you see that arch up there, it says depth of focus. And then on the back here, this is a Mercury Model CK. This is actually a fairly obscure and hard to find camera. And it's got all this information on how to focus depending on what film you're using and what sort of distance there is. And again, you can't look through the lens, so you're not seeing what the camera is seeing. So that's why pictures would be off a little bit. Well, with this one, you can look through and you're not looking through the lens, but this wheel turns this other wheel based on the range that you're trying to focus, and it does the focusing for you. So then you're actually getting things in focus. And that was a big development back then. And that was the beginning of Japanese cameras starting to become prominent in the marketplace. But it was right before World War II. So most people didn't have them until the 40s and 50s because the war came and we didn't really adapt that technology until then. But
before we get too far into the war, a couple questions were coming up because you are starting to talk about more sophisticated technology. And there's a few questions that have hit the chat that are saying in the idea of collecting cameras or the valuation of cameras. If it's a relatively rare camera, whether it works or not, does that have a impact on its value? Is it still worth collecting even if it's not working? And the related question is, how do you know if something doesn't work without actually trying to put film in it?
There are two categories of collectors. I had the good fortune to work at the Antique Mall in Pioneer Square in Seattle. And if any of you have visited there, there's this thing called the Underground Tour. And it lets out, and then the customers would walk right in after this interesting history tour, because Seattle's underground is amazing and has a very bawdy history. So they'd come in all kind of turned on and walk into this antique mall. And there was a case full of cameras, and there were two kinds of people who would buy out of them. One of them was somebody who said, that's really cool. It would look great on a shelf. That would make a fun display. My dad had one of those. They don't care whether they work or not. They just want to set it on the shelf. The other collector is someone who actually might use the camera. There are still art photographers. There's a group called the F-Stop Club, and they still use old film in old cameras for black and white photography and art photography until very recently. And it's gotten a lot better, and you can use a digital camera for almost anything now. But when digitals came out in the 90s, there were certain types of art photography that they couldn't really replicate at first. And so people are still buying them to use. So for those people, it really works. And things to look for on a camera, I'll get another rangefinder here. This one's a Konica, and this one's a little more complicated. What's nice is it's what they call a system camera. The Japanese were the ones who figured out that it's a real pain in the butt to put a light meter on, and then a rangefinder, and then another thing. I mean, for example, now this would have been for a big professional photographer, but look at the size and weight of this this color meter. You know, and this was supposed to be stuck in so that you could use it with a big, huge camera. I mean, that was a lot of weight and a lot of hassle. So as things go on, they start to incorporate more things. And with the with this camera, a rangefinder is a good example. The good thing is until later in the production, they mostly don't use batteries, but you may need a camera battery to test some of them. But you want to do things like test to see if the shutter works, to take the little spindle here and make sure it turns to advance the film. If you have a battery, then you can check and see if the flash works. You want to look at things like, is there corrosion? If you get a camera in fresh water, it can usually be safe, but if they've been exposed to salt water, the insides can be really bad. And then you also want to open a camera if you can. I think this one, I haven't actually looked to see how this one opens, so let's do one that I think I know how to do for certain. I believe, well, that would be a nice trick. Very good question, and I didn't really prepare. But basically, you want to, there's usually a button or two you press on the bottom. It's going to release, and the back's going to open. You want to look inside to make sure that it's not gunked up or corroded really badly. This is a Kodak Retina Reflex. This is a later one, again, with a good German lens. You want to make sure the lens turns and that all of the adjustments can be made anytime you see little levers and buttons. When I worked at the Antique Mall there, it would take 10 or 15 minutes to show in the camera case because the people who were interested really wanted to make sure everything went. There you go. There's the click that released it. And then you want to make sure the film advance works. So basically, you just run through all of it without the film. And if everything seems to turn and move and click and do what it should, it'll do it with film in it. On the old cameras, like the one that I showed at the beginning, one thing you want to make sure of, and I'll show you another plainer black Kodak. see how stiff the bellows are? And this one doesn't even have a lens. It's a parts camera. You want to make sure that the bellows are in good shape, that they don't seem to have pinholes, because any light that comes in is going to ruin your pictures. So really, it's, take time and give a good visual inspection. Generally, most cameras were kept pretty well because they were expensive, and so people prized them and took care of them. So usually they're going to be in good shape, but it pays to just kind of run through everything.
I want to be sensitive on time, so as we keep going, but I had a couple questions that came up, one of which happens to be from an example that I have. You've talked about all the technology that's been coming up, and I know that you've got a really cool camera you haven't shown us yet, but I also know that the Brownie existed for a really long time, even while all of these new technologies were being developed. So like this one is a Kodak Brownie Starmite camera. I happen to have it. I got it for a production to be on a theater set. I don't know if it works, but it does have the turns at the bottom. It's got the lock. I think when I did the research, the Starmite was from 1959 to 63. So you've talked about some great technology that was coming in. At what point, why were these still popular? If was the Brownie developing some of that technology too?
Not really. I have one that the Brownie Hawkeye here that sits on the shelf, and it's next to the grandparents' picture, and it's very simple. And that was why the Brownies kept going. This one actually only has one lens to look in for focus. And then, you basically, you point, you shoot, you turn the thing. It's still very simple. Just like cheap digital cameras. The digital camera has made so many things so easy that were hard before, but for a lot of people, this was as much as they could handle. They didn't want to have to adjust the lens. They didn't know what an aperture was. They didn't know what an f-stop was. They didn't know camera speeds. They just wanted to take a picture. And so the Brownies continue to be made. In fact, your Starmite, I think, is just about the last of the Brownie line. So basically that basic box point and shoot camera lasted from 1900 to almost 1970, at which point, and I think you have another camera, if you want to show it, from 1972 that will show you the replacement.
I don't have the camera. I actually have the film. So I just have
the film. Okay.
But I have a question. It's before we move on from this one, because you hadn't commented on this yet. You mentioned it in passing. So this one actually, because I don't know, I think this one was made around 60 or 61. There is at the bottom a little lever that you switch between color film and black and white film. So at what point did color photography enter the picture?
Color photography really becomes big because of the war. Did I cut you off? I'm sorry.
No, I made a bad pun. I was apologizing. So,
well, that's okay. I advertised this as expose yourself to vintage cameras, and then thought, sure, why not? We'll talk about that when we get into Polaroids. But anyway, the whole idea of the color thing was something that really developed during the war. Wars, as unfortunate as they are, especially the Second World War, really pushed technology, and they wanted Technicolor because when they were doing bombing raids and things like that, they couldn't really tell some of the stuff they needed to with black and white. So that really hastened the development of color film. And after the war, color film is pretty widely available pretty quickly because of it. And so, but it would be a different film than a black and white, and you would need a little different exposure. So on the point and shoot cameras, you push that and it's going to change those things for you. And you didn't have to know how, it just did it. So that was the idea. So that brings us full circle to where I interrupted you to begin with. We were just entering the war. So go ahead and move forward with as you were covering. Oh, sure. Well, right before the war in the 1920s and 30s, I think I showed the Zeiss camera before, and I'll show this one. This is a Rolleicord, and Rolleicord, Rolleiflex, all of these. You'll notice these have two lenses, and the idea again is we're trying to figure out how to solve the problem of we can't look through the lens and actually see what the camera is seeing, and so our picture is off a little bit from what we think we're shooting. So what they did was, and this starts, I think, in the late 20s, early 30s. This is called a twin lens reflex. So there's twin lenses. And the reflex is This one, you look in the top and you focus, you're focusing through this lens, but the picture is being taken through this lens. But that at least means that your lenses are in a line now. They're not off center. So at least you're in the right direction. And that was a big thing for photographers. And these cameras with the twin lenses like this, especially the German ones, a lot of these sell between $75 and a couple $100. So these are something to look for if you're out there. And if you can find one like the IcoFlex that has the lens cap, well, that's even better. And so that gets us into, if you remember, SLR cameras. So that's TLR, twin lens reflex. Well, then there's SLR. And this company, again, the Germans, 1933 is when Exacta came out. And this one's missing its lens again. But this company came out with the idea, and they were in Dresden. So unfortunately, they got bombed to death at the end of World War II. So it really took until the 50s for this to be widespread. But they came up with the first compact SLR camera. And what it does, you can see in there, I like that this doesn't have the lens. See the mirror here? You can look through the mirror. The mirror goes up to here where you're actually looking at the picture. And so you're seeing exactly what the lens sees. And then when you press the button, I don't know if it'll do it because it doesn't have the lens in it, but we'll see if it works. Yeah, no, this one's a parts camera. Oh, well, too bad. Oh, wait, no, it did. Let's try that again. What you'll see is that when you push the button, see how the mirror moves out of the way, and then it can take the picture. And that way you and the lens are seeing the same thing. So they finally overcame the problem of I'm shooting this thing and it's off a little bit. Once they figured that out, they came out with something really cool that I mentioned before, and that is the stereo camera. And the stereo camera has two lenses as well, but they are side by side. And this required something called stereo film. And the reason for that is this is taking two pictures at the same time. Did you have Viewmaster reels when you were a kid?
Oh, absolutely.
And did you have a grandparent or have you seen stereo cards?
Yeah, actually, I used to have a collection of those. I donated them to the theater for the production of Little Women.
Oh, how cool. And one thing I should say is I've sold a lot of cameras to people propping theaters. I've even rented cameras to people who just needed one to, you know, shoot an ad and have an old camera in it or something. The reason for the stereo camera was like stereoscopes. The way a stereoscope works is it's two pictures taken at just slightly different angles. So you have two lenses and you're taking the same picture. And there's that whole thing of parallax, you know, if you hold your finger up and you close one eye and then you close the other eye and it looks like it moved. Well, that's because your eyes, the lenses in your eyes correct that for you when both of them are working. The stereo camera does the same thing. It gives you two slightly different things. So when you print the pictures and you put them side by side, then you get 3D viewing. And so that camera, which I just showed you, the Revere 33, here's some nice paperwork about it. Paperwork for cameras is collectible too, manuals, all that stuff, the old boxes. If you see old camera stuff when the camera's gone, pick it up if it's cheap because there's resale potential. And then you would go home after you did that, you'd have these double slides made, and then you drop the slide in the slide viewer, and it was just like a Viewmaster, and all the stuff that you took, you could see the double image. And this one's cool. Again, this is Revere. It's part of a whole package. You bought the camera, you bought the slide holders, and you bought this. And then when you put your forehead to it, you could even turn it so that the lens is adjusted. So it was a neat package, and people really enjoyed it. And here's a lot of companies just started making stereo viewers so that you could, you know, it was the 50s. 3D movies were big, 3D cameras were big, and it's all because of this new technology. And these cameras sell pretty well. The Revere, if you've got the, I have everything but the box. If I had the box as well, that's probably $175 to $200. And they do come up in estate sales. And a lot of people, they've just been laying around because, oh, it was dad's or grandpa's old camera. And, oh, you know, then he got a new one and it just sat in a drawer and sure, $5, you know. I mean, there are sleepers out there.
So how did the actual film work for those stereo cameras? So you said it would create two individual negatives, or was it a joint negative, or is joint?
It actually would be done where they would print two separate slides, and then they would draw. I think I can show you. I think this might have the slide holder. Yeah, they look like this. So here's an example of a stereo camera slide. In fact, I'll put it this way. There's the Kodak advertising. There's the Kodachrome, like that Paul Simon song, if you're old enough. And here is one image, and here is the same image, just at a slightly different angle on the left. Let me hold it where hopefully you can see it, not in front of my head. So it's the same picture, but they're just at slightly different angles, and your vision that fixes parallax makes it come together, and it gives it a three-dimensional look. And so that's how they worked, is they really produced slides. They didn't really use the kind of typical snapshot roll film. It was a little different setup.
That's fascinating. And was that just a limited production like in the 50s? I've never seen one of those. So
most of them were in the 50s. I've got one other one here by a different company, I think. Now, I may have set it aside and decided one was enough to get the idea across, but a handful of people did them. Professional photographers and talented amateurs both liked to use them because it was fun. It was a novelty. And it pretty much persists into the 50s. It was kind of the peak, kind of like 3D movies sort of came and went as a fad. I think the cameras sort of did as well. But what came along instead is, all of a sudden we have a stereo camera, we have a point and shoot camera, we have all these different technologies. Well, it starts to get really complicated. You needed all these parts and attachments. And so that's when, like I was mentioning, the system cameras came out. And actually the first one was Nikon. This is a later one, but I'm going to show you this one because these Nikons that look like this, some of them were done for Kodak, and some of these can be $400 and $500 still online. I was quite surprised actually, because I thought, well, it's fairly modern, who cares? But apparently, because it has all these different interchangeable parts that are contained in one unit, this was a big deal. And Nikon started doing these where you could change lenses and components easily in the 1950s, and that's what put them on the map. And because of that, all the GIs who were stationed in Japan and Korea started bringing back Japanese cameras, and that's when the Japanese cameras start to really dominate the market here.
Now, one of the areas that we didn't really cover yet is, and I'm not sure exactly when it falls historically, but is the Polaroid camera. So that, yes, like when you mentioned the system camera, that's what made me think of it. That whole idea. Wow, that's big.
Yes, this weighs, oh gosh, I'd say at least 15 pounds. It's not really fun to hang on to. But yes, the Polaroid camera came out in 1948, and the problem it was solving was that it was development. You had to drop it off, you had to come pick it up. That was a hassle, and it wasn't very private. So if you wanted to take pictures of things, I have to be honest, this is terrible to say, but we all know it's true. One of the things that pushed development of the internet is, well, you could see certain kinds of pictures that you might not want everybody else to see. And Polaroids, they started out as this huge thing. They were rather expensive. They were mainly for people who had a professional reason to have a quick image made. And they were these giant things. And the early ones say Polaroid Land camera, because Edwin Land was the guy who invented them. And he figured out a way that you could go with a chemical process that he patented to make positive prints from exposed negatives within a minute. Well, in 1965, he came out with a small, less expensive version called, appropriately enough, the Swinger. And the Swinger in 1965 was a giant success and made Polaroid a household name. And a lot of them will... I'll just say I have been in several estate sales where I was conducting an estate sale, and in some obscure corner of the house were a bunch of Polaroids that I frankly would have done just as well without seeing. Sometimes you get to know your clients a little more personally than you expect, but they took off. And so that's where Polaroids came in.
Now you mentioned that you had mentioned a couple of the companies that had that supply film for a lot of different cameras. Are those Polaroid camera? Is that kind of film still available? So I remember, I'm a child of the 70s, so I remember this much smaller one, and it had the little pop-up top, and then the square image came out and then developed in your hand. Like that was kind of the cool thing. I've seen those in antique stores, and it's depressing to think that that's an antique, but vintage stores. But I would think that they'd be useless because I can't imagine that film is still available. Is that available?
You can get it, but there aren't very many people who like to shoot it because, again, a Polaroid, much like a Brownie camera, was something that was basically point and shoot, and it was easy, and you didn't have to know a lot to use it. And that was part of the appeal. But the images over time, we have noticed, if you see, like there were these plastic photo cubes in the 70s. I remember we had a picture of the dog and the cat in one and my sister in one. And all of those pictures over time have really started to fade, even though they were kept in an area with, not direct sunlight. The chemical process was fixative, but not in the same way that the actual roll film stuff and the stuff printed with silver gelatin and all of that was. And that was a bit of a problem for Polaroid. And so I do believe that somebody does make Polaroid film, but there's not a great call for it.
And one of the things we had talked about as we're wrapping things up in time-wise, that digital photography, at least from doing the research that I was doing and what we talked about, is way earlier than I thought. How far up does your collection go? Do you have any of the earlier, what did we say the first digital film was done in the 70s? Or the filmless camera was done in the 70s. Do you have anything in your collection that goes up that far?
I do have some things. I don't have any early digital, however. The digital in this collection seems to be later. Kodak actually invented the original digital camera, and it was actually all the way back to 1975, but it wasn't a super practical, or I should say filmless camera, not really digital. We didn't have that kind of computing then, but the first filmless camera. But it wasn't really practical. It was expensive, very few adapters, and they kind of shelved it, which is what a lot of big companies go through. A lot of our biggest companies, they're doing great with what they do, and they figure, yeah, we have this other technology, but why mess with that? We're making so much money now, and eventually the technology they invented and didn't pursue kills them, which is exactly what happened to Kodak. I don't have any of those handy. One thing I do have from the 70s, though, that actually spy cameras existed as far back as the 1880s and 90s. There's even hats that were disguised that were actually cameras. But little spy cameras, if you think of, James Bond and the whole spy sort of film industry, it became very popular to buy these little cameras where you could kind of hold it and just sort of discreetly go click, click, click and put it away. And it was very tiny, but they pull out and there's all your stuff. And these are pretty collectible. Usually they go for $40, $45 and on up from there. And so I wanted to show that. A couple other things that are newer, camera related, but not anything shaped like a camera, definitely collectible. This one has little scenes of Niagara Falls, which I'd share with you, but they're very tiny. But you click the button and you get to see all these pictures. So, there's all sorts of fun things, especially when you get into the 70s, variants on cameras that are interesting and valuable. Really digital stuff. I think the early Sony Mavica, where they used a big floppy disk, which was the first thing I used when I started doing eBay back in the day, that actually is starting to be collectible. So there is interest in early digital.
Oh, that's fascinating. Now, as we wrap up on time, a couple of the last questions. If you are, what are kind of the names to look out for? You mentioned Leica. Do you typically favor, or does the collector typically favor brands that no longer exist? Or can you still look for collectible Nikons and Canons, names that are still around? What tend to be the more favored?
I would say that the very most expensive do seem to be the German cameras, and earlier is more valuable typically. although there's no hard and fast rule. I've got a collector in Washington State who is, oh gosh, I think he might be 24 or 5 years old now. I've known him for 7 or 8 years. His parents and he come up and do a show that I do up in the mountains there. And he is really into Kodak, and he started collecting, and he collects anything Kodak, the swag, the advertising stuff, the cameras. He would be happy to have one of each kind they ever made in his collection. He just loves the stuff. And so I think it's really more particular to the interest of the person. Japanese cameras can be very collectible as well, and the Japanese love cameras. I mean, you would think they invented them. Speaking of Niagara Falls, I remember accidentally photobombing a bunch of Japanese tourists. I was on roller skates at Niagara Falls, and I was like, oh, looking at the falls, and all of a sudden I realized I'm rolling through their picture, and they're yelling at me in Japanese, and it was a moment. But so there's interest all over the world in these, and I think that Americans are open to all of them, to tell you the truth.
Great. And one last question, because I think this is also interesting as well, is just the ideas of how to display them. And more specifically, are there areas, do you have to keep them away from the window, light, heat, cold, that type of thing? Are there any special requirements for cameras?
I would say if you have something with the bellows again, even lenses like this one on the sled here, if you've got these kind of cardboard bellows, you want to make sure they don't get really, really dry. Because they will crackle. And you want to also, if you have the ones that fold up, you want to every so often take it out and open it. If you are, if you're leaving it like this, every so often open it up so that the bellows actually still work. Other than that, cameras are pretty rugged. They're pretty durable because they knew people were using them inside, outside, sun, rain, wind. They're usually heavy steel or some sort of very heavy, dense metal cases because they could get dropped. Later ones are pretty hard plastic. So, they hold up to stuff pretty well. And there isn't really a lot of issue of fading or that sort of thing that sunlight's going to do to them. I would say definitely avoid moisture. I'm telling you sort of conflicting things. Don't let them get too dry. Don't let them get too wet. But that's honestly the best advice.
Good to know. Well, we just hit the top of the hour, so I want to make sure we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. I've tried to hit as many of the questions as I can, but if anyone did not get one of their questions answered, George is very available through his social media at the Antique Nomad on Instagram. Are you still active on Periscope? I know you talked about
I tried to do something the other day for the first time in a long time, and the reception wasn't good. That's the one drawback with Periscope is you're going live, and sometimes I'm not in a good spot. A lot of this stuff, a lot of the reason I film stuff and don't go live that often is a lot of the antique stores are in old buildings, and the Wi-Fi gets bad in the back, and you burn a lot of data that way. So I haven't really done a lot of that lately, but I'm looking for opportunities to do that. So I'll try to go live on there soon.
Oh, very good. Well, if it's nothing else, the Instagram, he's available at the Antique Nomad. You can message him through that if you had some questions that you didn't get a chance to answer. And I'm available through most of my social medias at THMercantile, which is short for Trusty Huckster Mercantile. So thanks again for everyone for joining us for another Trusty's Vintage Deep Dive. Great thanks to George for giving us a great overview of his camera collection. I will be doing these twice a month. The next one is in 2 weeks, and that will be, I don't know if he's still on, he was on earlier, but the next one will be with Tim from Over the Years Collecting, and that will be focusing on uranium glass. So that will be on June 28th, and that'll be Tim from Over the Years. Definitely recommend you checking out his channel before then, but you'll be able to join us again on my channel, Trusty Huckster Mercantile. And again, thanks everyone for giving us your time and putting your trust in Trusty Huckster. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.